12 years ago, three siblings walked down to a dock in a quiet Florida town and never came back. There was no storm, no distress call, no wreckage drifting back to shore. Just a calm afternoon that ended in silence. In Cape Darrow, a place where people measured time by tides and tourist seasons, that silence never really left. It settled into conversations, into glances, into the way neighbors spoke more carefully around one particular house at the edge of town. Daniel Carter still lived there. At 58, he carried the weight of those 12 years in ways that didn't need explanation. The town remembered him as a skilled carpenter, someone who once had steady work building decks for beachfront homes and fixing up rental properties. That version of him felt distant now, like something that belonged to a different life. These days, his name came up in quieter tones, usually followed by a pause that said more than words could. Inside the house, time had split in two. Before the day his children disappeared and everything after. Patricia Carter refused to let the second half erase the first. At 56, she kept a job at a seafood restaurant along the harbor, working long shifts that paid just enough to keep the lights on and the bills from stacking too high. She held on to routine the way some people held on to faith. Not because it made things better, but because without it, everything would collapse. They still shared the same space, but their lives no longer moved together. Conversations had become short, functional, often avoided altogether. Grief had shaped them differently. For Patricia, it meant continuing, even when every day felt like a reminder. For Daniel, it meant being unable to move past the moment everything stopped. The names of their children were still spoken in the house, but carefully, almost as if saying them too freely might make the loss feel more permanent. Ryan had been 25, confident, ambitious, always looking ahead. The kind of person who made plans easily and believed they would work out. Megan, 22, had been quieter, more grounded, someone who noticed details others missed. Sophie, the youngest at 20, carried a brightness that made people feel at ease. Together, they had felt like a complete picture of a future that made sense. On the day they disappeared, nothing had seemed unusual. A short trip out on the water, something they had done before. Promised to be back before dinner. A routine moment that no one thought twice about. By the time concern replaced patience, it was already too late. The search had been immediate and intense at first. Boats scanning the coastline, helicopters circling overhead, volunteers combing through areas that might offer even the smallest clue. For months, hope stayed alive in small ways. A reported sighting that led nowhere. Debris that turned out unrelated. Each possibility raised expectations before quietly collapsing. 6 months later, the official statement came. The case would no longer be actively pursued. The explanation was simple and, to Daniel, impossible to accept. The Gulf could be unpredictable. Accidents happened. Boats capsized. People were lost. Nature had taken its course. That conclusion never settled into something he could believe. It stayed like an unfinished sentence, something that demanded an answer no one was willing to give. In Cape Darrow, the story shifted over time. First, it was tragedy. Then it became caution. Parents mentioned it when warning their kids about going too far out on the water. Eventually, it became something people remembered only when they passed by the Carter house or saw Daniel walking alone. 12 years changed the way people looked at him. Not with judgment exactly, but with a kind of distance. As if his grief had become something permanent, something that no longer surprised anyone. For Daniel, the days blended together. There was no clear separation between one and the next. Time didn't move forward so much as it repeated itself. Each morning carried the same awareness, the same absence that never softened. Patricia noticed it, even when she didn't say anything. The way he seemed disconnected from everything around him. The way the past held more presence than anything happening now. She had tried, in the early years, to pull him back into something that resembled a life. Conversations, suggestions, attempts to rebuild routines that might give them both something stable to hold on to. Over time, those efforts faded. Not because she stopped caring, but because she learned that not all wounds responded to effort. Their home remained filled with reminders. Photographs that had never been taken down. Objects left in place not out of neglect, but because moving them felt like admitting something neither of them could fully accept. The house held onto what had been, even as everything else moved on. In town, new stories replaced old ones. Businesses changed ownership. Families moved in and out. Life continued as it always does. But for Daniel and Patricia, everything still traced back to that single afternoon 12 years earlier. The unanswered question stayed at the center of it all. What really happened out there? For most people, it was a mystery that had settled into a likely explanation. For Daniel, it remained something unfinished, something that resisted every attempt to be closed. And without knowing it, without any warning, that unanswered question was about to surface again, no longer as a memory, but as something far more dangerous. Daniel did not plan to end up near the old fishing shack that afternoon. The town had a way of pulling him along familiar routes without much thought. The same streets, the same corners, the same quiet patterns that had replaced intention. But that day, something shifted. He moved past the usual turn toward the bar, past the places where people expected to see him, and kept going until the buildings thinned out and the noise of town life faded into something distant and irrelevant. The shack stood alone, a leftover from a time when the area had been busier, before newer docks and businesses drew activity elsewhere. It was not a place Daniel had visited often, but it carried a faint sense of recognition, something just beyond memory. He might have kept walking if not for the man working just outside it. At first, the figure did not fully register. Just another fisherman, another person going about his day. But as Daniel slowed, something about the posture, the presence, felt familiar in a way that demanded attention. Recognition came not all at once, but in pieces, assembling itself with a growing sense of unease. Logan Pierce. The name surfaced with clarity that surprised him. Logan had been around often, years ago. He had been one of Ryan's closest friends, the kind of person who showed up for dinner without needing an invitation, who stayed late, who blended into the rhythm of the household like he belonged there. Daniel remembered conversations that had felt easy back then, the kind of familiarity that comes from repeated presence. And yet, after the disappearance, Logan had been gone. Not gradually, not in a way that drew notice. Just absent. No calls, no visits, no appearance during the search efforts. At the time, there had been too many things happening, too many people coming and going, too much chaos to track every absence. Now, standing there 12 years later, the gap felt sharp, impossible to ignore. Logan noticed him a moment later. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Surprise came first, then something else that didn't fit the situation. Not simple discomfort, not the awkwardness of an unexpected reunion. Something closer to alarm. Daniel said his name more as confirmation than greeting. Logan responded after a brief pause, acknowledging him, but the tone lacked any sense of ease. Carried distance, restraint, as if every word required calculation. The years between them did not close in that moment. If anything, they became more defined. Daniel stepped closer, not out of aggression, but because something in the exchange felt incomplete. There was a question forming, one that had no clear shape yet but pressed forward anyway. They spoke briefly, surface level at first. Logan mentioned how long he had been living there, how he had been working with fishing crews, how the place suited him. The details sounded ordinary, but the delivery felt rehearsed, as if he had gone over them before. Daniel listened, not interrupting but not fully engaging either. His attention shifted between what was being said and what was not. There were gaps, small hesitations, moments where Logan seemed to choose words carefully instead of speaking naturally. It did not feel like a casual encounter. At some point, Daniel asked if he could step inside. The request came without a clear reason, but it carried weight. Logan hesitated before agreeing, just long enough to make the hesitation visible. Inside, the space reflected a life built on simplicity. Basic furniture, minimal decoration, everything arranged with a kind of controlled order. It was the kind of place that suggested someone who kept to himself, who avoided attention. Daniel sat down, allowing the silence to settle for a moment. Logan moved through routine actions, preparing coffee, focusing on small tasks that did not require conversation. The distance between them remained, even within the same room. Daniel brought up Ryan. The name changed the atmosphere immediately. Logan's response was short, acknowledging their friendship without expanding on it. There was no elaboration, no attempt to revisit shared memories. Just a statement, closed and contained. Daniel continued, referencing the past, the time when Logan had been around regularly. The familiarity of those years contrasted sharply with the complete absence that followed. He did not accuse directly, but the implication was there. Logan shifted the explanation toward difficulty, toward how hard that period had been. The words aligned with what anyone might say under the circumstances, but they lacked something essential. There was no depth behind them, no sense that they came from genuine reflection. The conversation stalled again. It might have ended there, another uncomfortable encounter with no resolution, if not for what Daniel noticed next. A photograph. It sat on a small cabinet, positioned in a way that suggested it was meant to be seen, even if not immediately obvious. At first glance, it appeared like any other old memory captured in time. But as Daniel focused on it, recognition hit with sudden clarity. Ryan, Megan, Sophie, all three of them on the boat. Daniel stood, moving closer, drawn by something that felt both familiar and wrong. The image was vivid in a way that made it impossible to dismiss. The expressions, the clothing, the setting, everything aligned with the last day they had been seen. This was not just a picture of them. This was the picture. The one taken the day they disappeared. The realization settled heavily, bringing with it a series of questions that no longer felt distant or theoretical. They were immediate, urgent, unavoidable. Daniel asked where the photo came from. Logan answered, but the response did not resolve anything. If anything, it confirmed what Daniel had already begun to understand. The connection was no longer uncertain. Logan had been there. The silence that followed carried more weight than anything said before. It stretched between them, filled with everything that had not been spoken for 12 years. Daniel turned, facing him fully now. There was no confusion left in his expression, no hesitation, just the beginning of a truth that had been buried for far too long. The shift happened without any raised voice. The space between Daniel and Logan no longer held uncertainty. It held something far more direct, an understanding that the truth had already surfaced, and whatever remained unsaid was no longer protected by time. Daniel did not move away from the photograph. He kept his focus on it, on the details that now carried a different meaning. The clothes matched what had been reported 12 years ago. The timing aligned too precisely to dismiss. This was not a memory preserved out of sentiment. It was evidence of presence. He asked a simple question. Logan did not answer immediately. The delay stretched long enough to remove any doubt about its significance. When the response came, it confirmed what Daniel had already begun to piece together. Logan had taken the photograph. He had been on that boat. He had been part of the day that ended everything. There was no attempt to deny it. The next realization followed naturally. If Logan had been there, then he knew what had happened. Not in fragments, not as speculation. He knew. Daniel repeated the question, this time with a clarity that removed any space for evasion. What happened that day? Logan tried to hold onto distance at first. He framed his words carefully, as if trying to control how much was revealed. But the structure collapsed quickly. The weight of the moment, combined with the years of silence behind it, left little room for partial explanations. It began with Ryan. According to Logan, the situation had not started that day. It had been building for months. Ryan had made connections with people outside the town, individuals tied to a distribution network that operated along the Gulf. It was not random. It was organized, deliberate, and profitable. Logan's involvement came through proximity. He had experience with boats, with navigation, with routes that avoided attention. Ryan approached him with an opportunity that promised easy money. The work sounded simple on the surface. Pick up packages offshore. Deliver them to a designated location. No questions asked. At first, Logan described it as temporary, something they could do for a short time. But the pattern established itself quickly. The payments increased. The expectations grew. What started as occasional runs became something more consistent, more structured. Ryan adapted to it faster than Logan did. He treated it as a step forward, a way to accelerate beyond the limitations of small-town life. There was confidence in the way he handled it, a belief that he understood the risks and could manage them. Logan admitted that he had doubts. Not immediately, but gradually. The people involved were not casual operators. Their presence carried an intensity that suggested consequences beyond anything they had initially imagined. Still, he continued. The final day did not begin differently from the others. The plan was routine. Pick up the shipment. Complete the handoff. Return before anyone noticed anything unusual. The difference came when Ryan brought Megan and Sophie along. Logan stated that this had not been part of the plan. He had questioned it. The explanation given was simple. It would make the trip look normal. A day out on the water. Nothing that would draw suspicion. Ryan believed it would be safe. Logan did not fully agree, but he did not stop it either. They reached the designated location. The handoff point was isolated, chosen specifically to avoid visibility. The process had worked before. There was no immediate reason to expect anything different. But something shifted. Logan did not describe the exact moment clearly. He framed it as a change in tone, in behavior, in the way the people waiting for them reacted. There was suspicion, questions that had not been asked before, attention that had not existed on previous runs. Ryan tried to manage it. Megan and Sophie became part of the problem. Their presence introduced uncertainty. They were not supposed to be there. They had seen things they were not meant to see. Logan left before the situation escalated. That decision became the dividing line between what he knew directly and what he understood afterward. He explained that Ryan had asked him to return to shore ahead of schedule. The plan was to finish the transaction and regroup later. It sounded controlled, contained, something that could still be handled. Logan followed that instruction. He did not go back. Before he had the chance, two men connected to the operation came to him. They knew where he was. They knew his involvement. The message was clear and delivered without ambiguity. The people on that boat were no longer his concern. Asking questions would create problems. Acting on those questions would create consequences. Logan described the moment as something that removed choice. Not in a dramatic way, but in a final one. The situation had moved beyond anything he could influence. When the disappearance became public, the connection formed instantly in his mind. The timeline, the context, the warning he had received, it all aligned too closely to ignore. He understood what had likely happened. But understanding did not translate into action. Daniel listened without interruption. The explanation unfolded in a way that did not soften anything. If anything, it made the past more concrete, more defined. The uncertainty that had lasted for 12 years began to take shape. Ryan had been involved in something dangerous. That part was now clear. Megan and Sophie had been placed in that situation without fully understanding it. That part carried its own weight. And Logan had known. That realization settled into something heavier than anger. It was not just about what had happened. It was about what had not been said afterward. The silence that followed. The years of not knowing. Daniel asked why. Logan's answer did not attempt to justify anything. Pointed to fear. To the nature of the people involved. To the belief that speaking up would not change the outcome, only extend the damage. It was an explanation built on self-preservation. 12 years of it. Daniel did not respond immediately. The information needed time to settle, to connect with everything that had come before. The official conclusion, the closed case, the acceptance that had never felt real. Now there was something else. Not closure, but direction. The idea that what happened was not an accident. Not the result of the ocean or chance. Something deliberate. Something controlled by people who had continued on with their lives while his family remained trapped in that unanswered moment. The past had not disappeared. It had been hidden. And now it was exposed, incomplete but undeniable, pointing toward something that had never been finished. Daniel left without trying to continue the conversation. There was nothing else Logan could add that would change what had already been said. 12 years of silence had ended in a matter of minutes, and what remained was no longer confusion. It was direction, sharp and unavoidable. The walk back into town did not feel the same as it had before. The familiar places no longer carried the same weight. For years, everything had been shaped by not knowing. Now there was something else taking its place. Not certainty, but enough truth to force action. Patricia was still at work when Daniel arrived. He did not wait for the end of her shift. The urgency had no room for routine. When she stepped away to meet him, the difference in his expression was immediate. She had seen him exhausted, withdrawn, detached. This was something else entirely. He told her everything. There was no attempt to soften it. No hesitation in naming what Logan had revealed. Ryan's involvement, the smuggling operation, the connection to organized crime, the warning that had kept Logan silent. The words moved quickly, carrying more than information. They carried the collapse of everything Patricia had believed about that day. At first, she rejected it. Not in anger, but in disbelief. The idea that their son had willingly stepped into something like that did not fit the person she had held onto for 12 years. It conflicted with every memory that had sustained her through the worst of it. But the details did not allow for easy denial. She remembered the money that had appeared without clear explanation. The late-night phone calls. The increasing number of trips that Ryan had described as casual, harmless. At the time, none of it had formed a complete picture. Now it did. The realization did not bring clarity. It brought a different kind of pain. One that reshaped the past instead of resolving it. They reached the same conclusion without needing to say it directly. This was no longer a closed case. The decision to go to the police followed naturally. Not because they trusted the system to fix everything, but because there was no other option left. The truth had to be placed somewhere outside of their own understanding. They returned home first. Nothing appeared out of place at a glance. The house held its usual stillness, the same arrangement of objects, the same quiet that had defined it for years. But something shifted as they moved further inside. It was not obvious, not immediate, just enough to create unease. Daniel noticed the door first. It had not been left like that. The detail seemed small, but it did not belong. Patricia confirmed it without hesitation. She had closed it before leaving. She always did. The realization came slowly, then all at once. Someone had been inside. They moved through the house carefully, not touching anything unnecessarily. The signs became clearer with each step. Subtle disruptions. Objects slightly out of place. Not chaotic, not careless, but deliberate. The bedroom held the clearest indication. Something had been left behind. A package sat on the bed, wrapped and positioned with intention. It was not hidden. It was meant to be found. On top of it rested an envelope, placed in a way that suggested it should be opened first. Patricia did not move closer. Daniel did. He opened the envelope without hesitation. The message inside was direct, printed in plain text, leaving no room for interpretation. They knew, not just about the past, but about what had been uncovered that day. The instruction that followed was simple. Stay silent. Do not go to the police. Consequences would follow if they did. The words did not threaten in a dramatic way. They did not need to. The fact that someone had entered their home, had placed the message there, had known exactly when to act, that was enough. Patricia read it again, as if repetition might change its meaning. It did not. The package remained unopened. Daniel considered it for a moment, weighing the risk against the need to understand. Patricia urged caution, pointing out what neither of them could confirm. Could be anything. Could be dangerous. Could be another message. But Daniel did not step back. He opened it. Inside was a tightly wrapped block of white powder. The packaging was precise, professional, consistent with something that was not meant to be handled casually. The meaning became clear immediately. This was not just a warning. It was a setup. Daniel recognized it even without experience in that world. If they went to the police now, they would not be arriving as victims. They would be arriving with evidence that placed them directly inside a criminal situation. The break-in, the note, the context, all of it could be dismissed or manipulated. Their credibility would be questioned. His reputation in town would not help. The conclusion formed quickly. This was control. A way to silence them without direct confrontation. A method that allowed the threat to exist without needing to be enforced immediately. Patricia understood it too. The question was no longer whether they should go to the police. It was how. Leaving the package behind was not an option. Disposing of it created its own risks. Keeping it in the house was worse. Every choice carried consequences that were difficult to measure. Daniel made the decision. They would go anyway. Not later. Not after considering alternatives. Immediately. The risk did not outweigh the need to act. Whatever had taken their children, whatever had kept the truth buried for 12 years, was still active. Still watching. Still capable of reaching into their lives without resistance. Waiting would not make it safer. They prepared to leave quickly. The package was placed into a bag. Handled carefully but without hesitation. Patricia gathered what she needed. Her movements focused, controlled, driven by the understanding that the situation had already escalated beyond anything they could contain on their own. The drive began in silence. Neither of them spoke as they moved through the familiar streets. The town looked the same, unchanged on the surface, but everything beneath that appearance had shifted. What had once been a place defined by memory was now connected to something present, something immediate. Halfway to the police station, flashing lights appeared behind them. The signal to pull over did not seem unusual at first. Routine stops happened. It was part of normal life. But nothing about the day had been normal, and that understanding altered how everything was interpreted. The officers approached from both sides of the car. Daniel explained before they could ask. He stated where they were going, why it mattered, what they needed to report. The response he received did not match the urgency of his words. It remained controlled, measured, professional. A request followed. Permission to search the vehicle. The situation tightened instantly. Refusing would escalate things. Agreeing would expose them. Daniel hesitated, then allowed it. The search did not take long. The bag was found. The package was removed, examined, and acknowledged without surprise. The reaction was subtle, but it carried meaning. The officers exchanged a look that suggested recognition, not discovery. Daniel tried to explain. He described the break-in, the note, the timing. He referenced the past, the case, the connection that had just been uncovered. He asked for Detective Marr, the one who had handled the original investigation. The response shifted. The tone changed from authority to something more cooperative. The suggestion that followed seemed reasonable on the surface. Instead of going to the station, they would be taken directly to someone who could handle the situation. Follow us. It sounded like assistance, felt like something else. But the decision had already been set in motion. There was no clear way to step back without making things worse. Daniel and Patricia returned to their car, and they followed. The drive did not follow the route Daniel expected. The direction changed gradually, then completely. The landmarks that should have appeared along the way never did. What had been presented as a simple detour turned into something else. Something that no longer aligned with the explanation given. Daniel noticed it first, not as a sudden realization, but as a quiet inconsistency that kept building. The streets became less familiar. The traffic disappeared. The sense of being guided somewhere specific replaced the idea of being assisted. Patricia felt it too. Neither of them said it out loud at first. The presence of the patrol car ahead made hesitation feel dangerous. The situation had already moved beyond normal procedure, but there was no clear point where it could be challenged without consequence. When the vehicle finally stopped, it was not at a police station. The house in front of them did not match anything Daniel remembered about Detective Marr. The location, the structure, the isolation, it all contradicted what had been implied. The explanation that had been offered on the road no longer held. Daniel kept the engine running. The officers stepped out and approached again, one on each side. The The same positions. The same controlled movements. But the tone had changed. Whatever pretense had existed before was gone. The instruction came directly. Get out of the car. Daniel refused. The response was immediate. What followed did not resemble law enforcement procedure. It was fast, decisive, and stripped of any attempt to maintain appearance. The moment confirmed what Daniel had already begun to understand. These were not police officers. The control they had established from the beginning was never about helping. It was about positioning. Daniel's resistance did not last. The situation did not allow for negotiation. The force used against him was precise and overwhelming, aimed at ending the interaction as quickly as possible. Patricia was handled the same way. Whatever attempt she made to react was cut short before it could change anything. The last thing Daniel registered before losing awareness was not the violence itself, but the clarity of it. The realization that everything had been orchestrated from the moment they left the house. When consciousness returned, it came slowly. The first awareness was disorientation, followed by pain, then the understanding that movement was restricted. The environment did not matter at first. What mattered was the loss of control, the inability to change position, the confirmation that he was no longer in any place connected to normal life. Daniel forced himself to focus. He was restrained. The situation stabilized enough for him to take in what was around him. The structure felt temporary, isolated. The kind of place chosen not for comfort or function, but for its distance from attention. He called out for Patricia. No response. The absence was immediate and complete. The next sound came from the door. 3 men entered. 2 of them were the same individuals who had posed as officers. Without the uniforms, the illusion was gone entirely. Their presence carried a different kind of authority now, one that did not rely on legitimacy. The 3rd man stood apart. He introduced himself without hesitation. Victor Moreno. The name did not need explanation. It carried weight in the way it was presented, in the confidence that followed it. This was not someone operating in the background. This was the person at the center of it. Daniel understood immediately. This was the man connected to everything Logan had described. The conversation began without pretense. Victor did not deny anything. There was no attempt to obscure the situation. He acknowledged the past in a way that confirmed its reality without offering detail. The focus was not on what had happened 12 years ago. It was on what was happening now. Daniel asked about Patricia. The answer came with a condition. She was alive. For the moment, the phrasing was deliberate. It established control without needing to expand further. The message was clear. Her safety depended on Daniel's response to the situation. Daniel asked about his children. Victor did not answer directly. Instead, he introduced something else. A screen. It activated with a delay that felt intentional. The image that appeared did not require explanation. It showed a confined space, controlled, monitored. Inside it were 3 figures, Patricia, and 2 women. Daniel recognized them even before his mind fully processed what he was seeing. Time had changed their appearances, but not enough to erase identity. Megan and Sophie were no longer the people he remembered, but they were still unmistakably his daughters. Alive. The impact of that realization replaced everything else. For 12 years, their absence had existed as a question without resolution. Now it had an answer. Not the one he had hoped for, but something far more concrete. They had been taken, and they had been kept. Victor allowed the moment to settle. He did not rush the reaction. He let the weight of it fully register before continuing. What he offered next was framed as a conclusion, not a negotiation. The past was irrelevant. What mattered was Daniel's awareness. He knew enough to become a problem. The warning left at the house had been clear. The expectation had been silence. Instead, Daniel had moved toward the police. That action had triggered the response. This was the consequence. Daniel tried to speak, to push for more information, to understand the conditions under which his family had been kept. Victor did not engage with those questions. The focus remained fixed on resolution. Daniel was no longer needed. The process that followed was methodical. Containers were brought in. The smell that accompanied them confirmed their purpose. The structure itself was being prepared as a disposable element. Everything inside it was meant to be erased. Victor remained composed. He treated the situation as routine, something that had been handled before, something that required no emotional investment. The presence of the screen remained active, continuing to display Patricia, Megan, and Sophie, reinforcing the message without needing to repeat it. Daniel understood what was coming. This was not about intimidation anymore. It was about elimination. Victor gave him a final moment, not out of mercy but out of control. A calculated pause that emphasized the inevitability of what would follow. The lighter appeared in his hand, its function obvious. Daniel did not look away from the screen. If this was the last moment, it would not be spent in confusion. It would be anchored in the only thing that mattered, the confirmation that his family was still alive, even if the circumstances were beyond anything he could change. Victor ignited the flame. The action was simple. The effect was immediate. The fire spread quickly, following the path that had been prepared. The structure responded exactly as intended. There was no hesitation, no delay. The plan had been executed before, refined, perfected. Victor left. The door closed. The sound of it marked the final separation between control and survival. Inside, the situation changed completely. The environment became hostile within seconds. The air thickened. The heat intensified. Every element of the space worked against the possibility of escape. Daniel's restraints remained. The screen continued to display his family. The contrast between what he had just seen and what he was now facing created a single, unavoidable conclusion. If he did not survive, they would not be saved. And the truth, after 12 years, would disappear again. Daniel did not allow the panic to take over. The moment demanded something else. For 12 years, everything had been defined by not knowing. Now he knew enough. That knowledge did not offer comfort, but it gave direction. Megan and Sophie were alive. Patricia was alive. Whatever happened next depended entirely on whether he could get out. The fire was not something he could reason with. It advanced without pause, without negotiation, turning the space into something that rejected hesitation. The restraints that held him in place became the only problem that mattered. If they remained, nothing else would. He forced his focus onto the details around him. Not the heat, not the pressure of the moment, but the smallest possible advantage. Something that could be used. Something that had not been intended as part of the trap. There was no tool offered to him. Nothing placed within reach for his benefit. But there were flaws. Small, overlooked elements that had no value to anyone except someone desperate enough to use them. He worked at the restraints with precision, ignoring the pain that came with it. Time was not measured in minutes anymore. It was measured in seconds of opportunity. The fire did not slow. It did not wait for him to succeed. The first break came suddenly. It was not clean. It was not easy. But it was enough. One hand came free. That changed everything. The rest followed faster, driven by urgency and reinforced by the only thing that mattered. The image of his family still visible in his mind. The understanding that survival was not just about him. It was about what came next. By the time he reached the exit, the structure had already begun to collapse into itself. The path out was not clear, but it was still possible. That was enough. The transition from inside to outside did not bring relief. It brought clarity. The people who had put him there were gone. They had no reason to stay. The plan had been executed exactly as intended. From their perspective, there was nothing left to manage. Daniel did not waste time trying to understand the location. That could come later. What mattered was distance. Getting away from the immediate danger, creating space to think, to act. The collapse came quickly after. He did not look back. The next problem arrived almost immediately. The condition he was in made everything slower, harder. Movement required effort that was not sustainable. The body could only push so far before it began to fail. He needed help. That realization carried risk. Anyone connected to what had just happened could still be nearby. The wrong contact would not just end his chances. It would confirm that he had survived. But without assistance, survival would not last long enough to matter. The decision was made without hesitation. He moved until he could not continue, until the effort itself became the barrier. That was when the next presence appeared. The man introduced himself simply, Hadi Rahman. The name did not carry immediate meaning for Daniel, but the behavior did. There was no confusion in the way Hadi approached the situation. No uncertainty about what needed to be done. The actions were direct, efficient, practiced. The help was not offered as a question. It was given as a decision. Daniel accepted it. There was no reason not to. At this point, survival depended on it. The initial treatment focused on stabilization. Not comfort, not recovery. Just enough to prevent the situation from getting worse. Enough to create the possibility of movement later. Only after that did the conversation begin. Daniel did not wait. He asked about his family. Hadi did not respond immediately. The delay was not hesitation. It was calculation. A choice about how much to reveal and when. When he did speak, it changed everything again. He confirmed the connection. He had been part of the same operation years ago. Not at the same level as Victor, but close enough to understand how it functioned. Close enough to know what had happened during the time Daniel had been left in the dark. Ryan had not survived that day. The explanation was direct, without embellishment. The situation had escalated. The presence of Megan and Sophie had created a problem. Ryan had tried to intervene. The response had been immediate and final. There had been no attempt to preserve him. His body had not been recovered. The location had ensured that. The information landed without room for denial. For 12 years, the possibility had existed. Now it was confirmed. Daniel did not respond. There was no immediate reaction that could match the weight of that truth. It did not replace the urgency of the moment, but it reshaped it. The mission had changed, even if the direction remained the same. Hadi continued. Megan and Sophie had been taken. Not for ransom, not for negotiation, for use. They had been kept within the system, moved between locations, controlled through fear and dependency. Over time, they had become part of the operation itself, forced into roles that made them useful. It was not a temporary situation. It had been sustained. For 12 years, Daniel absorbed the information piece by piece. Each part connected to the next, forming a structure that explained everything the official investigation had failed to uncover. There was one more detail. Hadi knew where they were now. The location was not fixed in the way a normal place would be. It shifted based on need, based on risk. But there was a current base of operations. A place used for storage, coordination, control. An abandoned site, far enough from populated areas to avoid attention. Daniel focused on that. The past could not be changed. The confirmation about Ryan, the years Megan and Sophie had lost, the role Patricia had been forced into. All of it existed beyond correction. But the present was still open. That was enough. The decision came immediately. They would go. Hadi did not agree at first. Not because he questioned the goal, but because he understood the risk. The operation they were dealing with was not small. It was not fragile. It had survived for years by adapting, by eliminating threats, by maintaining control over its environment. 2 people would not be enough. Daniel did not argue. He acknowledged the reality of it, then moved past it. Waiting was not an option. Every delay increased the chance that the situation would change again, that Megan and Sophie would be moved, that Patricia would be placed somewhere even harder to reach. The only viable approach was to act. Hadi adjusted the plan. Not direct confrontation, not immediate engagement. Observation first, confirmation, then contact with the authorities. There was a way to reach them without exposing their position. A satellite phone. It had been kept for emergencies, for situations that required communication beyond normal channels. Disqualified. Daniel agreed. The objective became clear. Reach the location. Confirm presence. Call it in. Let the system respond with the force required to end it. It was not the kind of plan that guaranteed success, but it was the only one that made sense. They prepared to move. Daniel's condition had improved enough to allow it. Not fully, not comfortably, but sufficiently. The mission was no longer about survival alone. It was about ending something that had been left unfinished for 12 years, and bringing back what was still left of his family. They moved forward with a plan that depended on timing, distance, and restraint. Daniel and Hadi reached a position where observation was possible without immediate detection. The site operated with structure. Movement followed patterns. Individuals were assigned roles. It was not chaotic. It was controlled, efficient, and built to function without interruption. Daniel recognized the difference immediately. This was not a temporary setup. It was established, maintained, and protected. The scale of it confirmed what Hadi had already implied. This was an operation that had survived because it had learned how to avoid attention. The first confirmation came quickly. Megan and Sophie were there. It did not take long for Daniel to identify them among the movement. The years had changed them, but not enough to erase recognition. There was a distance in the way they existed within the space, something that reflected prolonged control rather than choice. Patricia was there too. That realization anchored everything. The urgency increased, but the plan did not change. Acting too soon would end everything before it could begin. Daniel understood that now. The impulse to move, to close the distance, to break the situation immediately, it had to be controlled. Hadi initiated the next step. The call was made using the satellite phone. The information provided was precise. Location, structure, number of individuals, visible activity. The response from the other end confirmed that the situation was being taken seriously. Units were already moving. That detail shifted the timeline. They were no longer alone in the effort, but they were still the only ones in position. Daniel stayed focused on the site. The operation did not slow. If anything, it began to accelerate. Movement increased. Groups reorganized. Vehicles were prepared. It was not random. It was reactive. They knew something. Not everything. Not yet. But enough to begin adjusting. Then Daniel saw it. Megan and Sophie were being moved. Patricia was with them. The purpose became clear quickly. The preparation, the timing, the structure of the movement, it all pointed in one direction. They were being transferred. Used again. The realization tightened the situation instantly. If they were moved now, the window would close. The police response would arrive at an empty location. The operation would continue somewhere else, and the chance to end it would be lost. Daniel made the decision. Waiting was no longer an option. Hadi understood it without needing explanation. They moved back to the vehicle. The plan changed from observation to intervention. The timing had to be exact. Too early and they would be overwhelmed. Too late and the transfer would be complete. They followed the movement at a distance, maintaining visibility without drawing attention. The route was deliberate, designed to avoid main roads, to minimize exposure. The transfer point came into view. Another vehicle waited. The process was already underway. Daniel did not hesitate. Hadi accelerated. The impact was not part of the original plan, but it became the only viable option. Disruption had to be immediate, decisive, enough to break the structure of the transfer. The collision achieved that. The sequence that followed unfolded quickly. The individuals managing the transfer lost control of the situation. The structure broke. The coordination collapsed. For a brief moment, there was no system, only reaction. Daniel moved toward the closest threat. The objective was simple. Remove the immediate danger. The effort required everything that remained in him. The injuries, the exhaustion, the strain of the past hours, all of it became secondary. The only measure that mattered was whether he could create enough space for his family to break free. The first confrontation ended in his favor. It did not resolve the situation, but it created an opening. Megan saw him. The recognition was immediate. There was no hesitation, no confusion. 12 years had passed, but the connection remained intact. It did not require explanation. Sophie followed. The distance between them closed. The reunion was not clean. It was not controlled. It was defined by urgency, by disbelief, by the sudden collapse of everything that had kept them apart. Daniel confirmed what mattered most. They were alive. They responded in kind. Patricia was not with them. Daniel turned. She was there, but something was wrong. The position, the lack of movement, the silence that surrounded her. It all pointed to a single conclusion before it was fully confirmed. He reached her. The situation became clear immediately. The injury was severe. The timing aligned with the chaos that had just unfolded. The shots fired during the disruption, the lack of control in the moment, it had been enough. Daniel tried to stabilize it. The effort was immediate, focused, driven by the same instinct that had carried him through everything up to this point. Patricia responded, but only briefly. The connection was still there. She recognized him. She recognized what had happened. There was no confusion in her expression, no misunderstanding of the situation. The years, the distance, the control that had been placed over her, all of it gave way to a single moment of clarity. She understood that he had found them, that the effort had not been wasted, that Megan and Sophie were no longer alone. The words she left behind were not complicated. They did not attempt to explain anything or resolve what could not be resolved. They focused on what remained, their daughters. The responsibility shifted in that moment. Daniel accepted it without question. The change was immediate. Patricia's presence moved from active to final. The reality of it did not fully settle, but it did not need to. The situation did not allow for it. Megan and Sophie reached her. The loss was not delayed. It was immediate, shared, and impossible to process in the context of everything else happening around them. The operation continued. Law enforcement arrived in force. The response was coordinated, overwhelming, designed to end the situation completely. The remaining members of the operation were engaged, contained, and taken into custody. Victor Moreno was among them. The system that had operated for years was dismantled in a matter of hours. Daniel remained with his daughters. The contrast defined the moment. They had been found. They had been taken back. And at the same time, they had lost something that could not be replaced. The reunion was real. So was the cost. There was no resolution that balanced both sides. Only the understanding that after 12 years, the truth had finally surfaced, and everything that followed would have to be built from what remained. The days that followed did not move in a straight line. They came in fragments, shaped by procedures, questions, and the slow return to a world that no longer felt the same. Daniel remained close to Megan and Sophie as they were taken into medical care, their condition assessed beyond what could be seen on the surface. What had been done to them over 12 years could not be measured in a single moment, and no report could fully describe it. Law enforcement treated the case as more than a rescue. It became an investigation into a network that had operated for years without interruption. The arrests made at the site were only the beginning. Information gathered from the operation began to connect to other cases, other disappearances, other patterns that had gone unnoticed or unchallenged. Victor Moreno was no longer in control. The structure he had built had been exposed, and the people who had followed him were now being processed, questioned, and documented. The system that once protected them had begun to collapse. Daniel gave his statement when he was able. He described everything in order, without embellishment. The encounter with Logan, the discovery at the house, the false officers, the fire, the rescue, and the final confrontation. Each part connected to the next, forming a narrative that investigators could follow, verify, and expand. There were questions he could not answer. There were gaps that only others could fill. But what he provided was enough to confirm what had been hidden for 12 years. The name of the original detective surfaced during the process. Angus Marr. The same man who had closed the case after 6 months. The same man who had assured Daniel that nothing more could be done. The investigation into Marr did not begin that day, but the events surrounding the Carter family forced it forward. Internal records, past decisions, connections that had been overlooked, all of it was re-examined. The possibility that the case had not simply failed, but had been influenced, changed the direction of everything that followed. Mar was located. The outcome of that part of the story would take time, but the implication was already clear. The truth had not just been lost. It had been suppressed. Logan turned himself in. His role in the past and his actions in the present placed him in a position that was difficult to define. He had been part of the silence that allowed everything to continue, but he had also been responsible for breaking it. His cooperation provided details that strengthened the case against Moreno's network, confirming routes, contacts, and methods that investigators needed. Daniel saw him once, briefly, after the arrest. There was no attempt at reconciliation. The distance between them remained. But the conversation did not carry the same weight as before. The focus had shifted. What mattered now was what came next, not what had already been done. Hadi was taken into custody as well. His past could not be ignored. His involvement in the operation, even if it had ended years earlier, placed him within the reach of the law. At the same time, his actions in saving Daniel and guiding him back to his family were recognized. The situation moved beyond a simple judgment, involving multiple governments and legal systems. Daniel made it clear what Hadi had done. He spoke about it in his statement in every opportunity he was given, not as an attempt to erase the past, but to acknowledge what had changed. Whether that would alter the outcome was uncertain, but it was not something Daniel could ignore. Mara's funeral brought the town together in a way that had not happened in years. Cape Darrow remembered. People who had once avoided the subject, who had allowed the Carter family's loss to become something distant, now stood in recognition of what had been endured. The service did not attempt to make sense of everything. It did not offer explanations or answers that could resolve the past. It focused on what Mara had done. She had held the family together for as long as she could. She had continued when it would have been easier to stop. She had believed, even when there was no reason to believe. Daniel stood with Megan and Sophie beside him. They were no longer the same people who had left 12 years earlier. Time had changed them in ways that could not be undone. But they were there. They were alive. That fact existed alongside the loss, not in place of it. After the funeral, the house felt different. Not because anything had changed physically, but because everything inside it carried new meaning. The past was no longer defined by absence alone. It now included what had been found, what had been lost, and what remained. Megan and Sophie began the process of speaking about what had happened to them. Not all at once, and not in a way that followed a clear structure. Their experiences came in pieces, shaped by memory, by trauma, by the need to be understood without being overwhelmed. Professionals guided those conversations, helping them place events into context, helping them move from survival into something closer to recovery. Daniel listened. He did not interrupt. He did not try to correct or reinterpret. He allowed their version of the past to exist as it was, without forcing it into the shape he had carried for 12 years. There were things he learned that he had not expected. The way they had been controlled. The way movement had been restricted. The way choices had been removed and replaced with consequences. It was not a single event that defined their experience. It was a system that had shaped their lives day by day. And yet, within that system they had endured. That fact mattered more than anything else. The legal process continued. Charges were filed. Evidence was presented. The scope of the operation expanded as more information came forward. What had once been hidden within a small coastal town now reached beyond it, connecting to larger networks, larger patterns. Daniel attended when he could. Not out of obligation, but because it mattered. The truth that had been denied for so long was now being documented, recorded in a way that could not be dismissed or forgotten. Time moved forward again. Not in the same way it had before, but with a different kind of direction. The days were no longer defined by waiting for answers. They were defined by what could be done with what had been found. Megan and Sophie began to rebuild their lives. The process was slow, uneven, filled with setbacks that did not follow any predictable pattern. But there was movement. There was progress. There was the possibility of something beyond what they had been forced to endure. Daniel changed as well. Not suddenly and not without effort. The habits that had defined the past 12 years did not disappear on their own. But the reason behind them had shifted. The absence that had driven him no longer existed in the same way. It had been replaced by responsibility. He was no longer waiting for his children to return. They were already there. One evening, the three of them sat together in the living room, surrounded by the same photographs that had once represented a life interrupted. Ryan's image remained among them, unchanged by everything that had been revealed. They spoke about him, not as a mystery, not as a question, but as someone who had existed, who had made choices, who had paid for them. The complexity of that truth did not reduce him. It made him real. Megan suggested a memorial, not just for Ryan, but for everyone who had not made it out. The idea carried weight. It acknowledged loss beyond their own, connecting their story to others that had ended without resolution. Daniel agreed. It was something they could do, something that gave meaning to what had been taken. As the day came to an end, the house no longer felt like a place frozen in time. It held the past, but it was not defined by it alone. It held the present, with all its challenges, all its uncertainty, and all its possibility. Daniel looked at his daughters, at the lives that had been returned to him in a form he had never expected. Nothing had been restored completely. Nothing ever would be. But something had been recovered. And that was enough to begin again. Because in the end, what survived was not the absence of loss, but the refusal to let that loss be the final word. Thank you sincerely for taking the time to listen to today's story. Your presence here means more than you may realize. Stories like this are not just about what happened, but about what we carry forward after everything falls apart. Behind every moment of pain, there is a choice, whether to give up or to keep going, even when the path ahead feels uncertain. What this story reminds us is simple, yet powerful. Truth may be buried, time may pass, and life may break us in ways we never expected, but resilience, love, and the will to keep moving forward can still lead us back to what matters most. Not everything can be restored, and not every loss can be undone. But healing begins the moment we refuse to stop trying. If this story touched you in any way, if it made you reflect, feel, or see life a little differently, that connection is exactly why this channel exists. Your support helps us continue sharing meaningful stories like this one. To support our channel, it only takes a moment. Please press like, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and subscribe to stay with us on this journey. Every interaction from you is a small but meaningful way to keep these stories alive and reaching more people who may need them. Thank you again for being here.